A new Amazon Ipsos poll finds that 8 in 10 Americans think that the current $7.25 hourly federal minimum wage is too low, and 2/3 support increasing it all the way to $15 an hour.
That's right. So, friend of the show, former National Press Secretary for the Sanders campaign, contributing editor at Current Affairs and host of the Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray. She joins us now to discuss. Good to see you, Briahna. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to see you, too.
So, Briahna, what did you make of this poll? Pretty stunning in its results generally for the $15 minimum wage, and then match it up against what happened with the reconciliation bill.
You know, polls that show that overwhelming majorities of Americans like progressive policies have ceased to surprise me, I'm afraid. Although this one is a particularly stunning result. Overwhelming majority of Americans, 8 in 10, understand that the minimum wage, which hasn't been raised in the longest period since we got a minimum wage in 1938, they understand, obviously, that it's time for a hike, and not just any hike. 2/3 of Americans think it should be raised to $15 an hour. And yet, we had just recently an instance in which we saw the Biden administration, despite all of its campaign promises, refuse to fight for this issue, which would have been one of the only permanent structural changes to come out of the COVID relief bill.
So, speaking of that, Ron Klain was on with Mehdi Hasan talking about exactly this issue, claiming that they really still want to fight. Let's take a look at that.
Mehdi, we're definitely going to push for the minimum wage. We're in the fight for 15. We're obviously disappointed that it got pulled out of this on a parliamentary point. We actually thought we had a way to get the minimum wage raised. It hadn't been raised for decades, raised in the first 50 days. That would have been really quite incredible. But we are going back at it to try to find a legislative strategy to get the votes together to pass the minimum wage.
What do you make of that, Brie?
The legislative strategy would have been ignoring the parliamentarian. I mean, I was racking my brain, and nowhere in my law school studies, nor in my primary or secondary education, do I recall the parliamentarian being a fourth branch of government that could be an obstacle in a case like this. As much as the media has obscured this reality, the parliamentarian's ruling was purely advisory. So stage one, it was wrong, according to a lot of experts. You only have to glance at history to see the kinds of things that have been passed through reconciliation, which have much lower, a much more attenuated relationship to what the standards are to passing the Byrd Rule, right? We had Arctic drilling opened up by Donald Trump via budget reconciliation. You had welfare reform passed through budget reconciliation, and somehow this was a bridge too far. And then you had Joe Biden signaling over a week before the parliamentarian's ruling that he didn't think the parliamentarian was going to come out in favor of the $15 minimum wage passing through this way, despite the overwhelming belief of progressives that it absolutely would, which begs the question, was he ceding the ground for that kind of an outcome? And then once the parliamentarian did rule, of course, he could ignore her ruling, and alternatively, the vice president could vote to overturn the ruling. They chose not to do that as well, and in fact pursued a posture that would make it almost impossible for progressives like Bernie Sanders to try to push a $15 minimum wage through. So this fiction that they're continuing a fight, the mass coordinated tweet storm of people across the ideological aisle saying that, of course, we're still going to fight, it seems a little hollow, especially understanding that there aren't going to be more opportunities with more leverage coming down the pike anytime soon.
Well, and Briahna, I wondered also what you made of Biden's recent comments to George Stephanopoulos, opening the door to not getting rid of the filibuster, but reforming it, making it a talking filibuster. Some open questions whether that really accomplishes much at all. What is your view of that?
Well, the thing with Joe Biden that I hope we've all learned at this point is to not take these kinds of off-the-cuff statements as gospel. We heard him say a lot more stridently for a year during the primary about that he was committed to raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, that he was committed to a paltry, but at least it's something, $10,000 in student debt relief. And now we're seeing reports this morning that a team of liberal think tanks are advising the White House on how to get people back on track with paying their student loan debts at the end of this year. So, if it were true, it would at least be a meaningful step in the right direction from someone who has been, up until this point, fairly hostile to the idea of any kind of filibuster reform. But what I think this really reflects is that the administration is having a harder and harder time answering the question, why are you intentionally handcuffing your own administration to the whims of the Joe Manchins of the world at this early date, especially in a moment of crisis? And I think this rhetorical pivot might just be a way to get out from under that really difficult question that a lot of Americans are asking right now, especially given the polls that we started this segment with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Briahna, always great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Briahna.
Same here.
I'll have more Rising for you after this.